Tonight we travel back to the darkest time in American history, a time when brother fought against brother, when families were ripped apart by different beliefs, and when the future of a young country was in danger. This is the story of the American Civil War. A war so terrible that it took more American lives than all other wars put together. So before you sit back, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. It is always fun to see who is watching from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that quiet humming sound, and let's start tonight's story together. The year was 1819, and the United States of America was balanced very carefully, like on the edge of a knife. There were 11 free states and 11 slave states. From the outside, it looked like everything was perfectly even, a balance that kept the young country working. But under that calm look, something much worse was starting to grow. The country that said all men were created equal was struggling with a huge problem in its heart. How could a nation built on freedom keep 4 million people as slaves? The men who started the country had known this problem would come. Thomas Jefferson had even written words against slavery in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, but they took it out because they were afraid of losing help from the South. They just pushed the problem to later years, hoping someone else would fix it. But now, as the country grew toward the West, the problem finally arrived like a loud crash of thunder. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 looked like an answer back then. Missouri would come in as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and a line would be drawn across the land at 36 degrees, 30 minutes north. Everything above the line would be free, everything below could have slavery. Henry Clay, called the Great Compromiser, had put this careful plan together, thinking he had fixed the slavery problem for good. He was very wrong. But even while leaders were happy about their smart answer, the differences in money and way of life between North and South were growing bigger, like a giant crack. The North was quickly becoming full of factories, its cities filled with people who came from Ireland and Germany, its factories busy with new ideas. The South stayed mostly farming, its money made from the work of enslaved people on huge farms under the hot sun. Cotton was the most important crop, and slavery kept it going. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had changed the South's money-making overnight. Separating cotton from its seeds used to take a lot of hard work by hand, but now a machine could do it fast, making cotton very profitable. But this new machine came with a terrible price. It made slavery even more important, more valuable, and more protected than ever before. Southerners called slavery the peculiar institution, but it was not just a way of treating people, it was the base of their whole life. In the North, a different kind of change was happening. The Second Great Awakening had spread through the area like a big fire, bringing new focus on doing what is right and helping others. People who wanted to end slavery, called abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison, printed strong newspapers saying slavery was a sin against God and people. The Underground Railroad, a secret path of safe houses and brave helpers, let thousands of enslaved people escape to freedom in the North and Canada. Yet, even in the North, many people had mixed feelings about slavery. Many did not hate slavery because they cared about black people, but because they were afraid free slave work would take jobs and lower pay for white workers. Others worried that letting slavery grow would give too much power to Southern farm owners. The argument that slavery was wrong because it hurt people was getting louder, but it was still just one voice among many worries about money and power. You could feel the anger in Congress, where leaders from North and South looked at each other with less and less trust. Every new land that wanted to become a state could break the careful balance. Every talk about taxes or new roads turned into a fight about what kind of country America would be. Things were falling apart, and people on both sides started to wonder if the country could stay together. In the small homes of enslaved people on Southern farms, 4 million African Americans lived in slavery, their lives controlled by owners who could buy, sell, whip, or kill them without punishment. Families were broken apart at sales, children sold away from parents, husbands taken from wives. The pain in their hearts from slavery was as bad as the hurt on their bodies. Yet even when things were hardest, enslaved people kept their strength, their songs and stories, their hope for freedom. They sang songs about being saved one day, told stories to remember who they were, and never stopped believing that someday they would be free. Free black people in the North had their own hard times. They were free by law, but faced unfair treatment everywhere. Most states would not let them vote, be on juries, or go to public schools. They could not work many jobs and had to live in certain neighborhoods. Yet they kept going, building churches, schools, and stores, and becoming some of the strongest voices to end slavery. Frederick Douglass, born a slave but taught himself to read and write, became one of the best speakers of his time. His talks and books showed the terrible truth of slavery to people across the North and Europe. As the 1840s began, the question of letting slavery grow into new lands became more important than ever. The Mexican-American War had given the United States huge new areas, and people could not avoid deciding if slavery would be allowed there. The Wilmot Proviso wanted to ban slavery in all land taken from Mexico. It passed the House of Representatives, but died in the Senate. The sides were forming, and agreeing was getting harder. The Compromise of 1850 was Henry Clay's last big try to keep the country together. California would come in as a free state. The lands of Utah and New Mexico would decide about slavery themselves by letting the people their vote on it. The buying and selling of slaves would end in Washington, D.C. And a stronger law would make people in the North help catch and return escaped slaves. It was a big set of deals that gave something to both sides but made neither side happy. The Fugitive Slave Act made people in the North especially angry. Suddenly, free black Americans could be grabbed on the street and sent back to slavery with almost no way to fight it. White people in the North, who did not care much before now, had to help catch slaves or get in trouble with the law. The law turned every town in the North into a possible fight between slave catchers and people against slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe's book Uncle Tom's Cabin came out in 1852 and showed the real pain of slavery to families in the North with strong feelings. The book sold more than 300,000 copies in its first year and was turned into plays all over the North. People in the South called it lies and bad stories, but no one could deny how it changed what people in the North thought. When Stowe met President Lincoln years later, he is said to have told her, "So, you're the little lady who wrote the book that started this big war." The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 broke the Missouri Compromise and let terrible fighting start. Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois, who wanted to build a big railroad across the country through his state, suggested letting the people in Kansas and Nebraska decide about slavery by voting. This meant the old line from the Missouri Compromise that kept slavery south was gone. People reacted fast and with anger. Leaders in the North called the act a betrayal of old promises. Leaders in the South saw it as a chance to let slavery grow into new places. But the worst fighting happened right in Kansas. People who wanted slavery from Missouri, called border ruffians, crossed over to vote in elections. People against slavery, many helped by groups from the North, built their own towns and got ready to fight for Kansas. The result was Bleeding Kansas, a small taste of the bigger war coming. Elections had cheating and fighting. Two different governments said they were the real one. Groups with guns rode around the land, burning houses and killing people who disagreed. The worst moment came in May 1856, when people who wanted slavery attacked the Free Soil town of Lawrence, breaking printing machines and burning buildings. 3 days later, a man against slavery named John Brown led a night attack on people who wanted slavery at Pottawatomie Creek. Brown and his men pulled 5 men from their beds and killed them with swords. The Pottawatomie massacre shocked the whole country and made John Brown one of the most argued about people of the time. To people against slavery, he was a hero fighting evil. To people in the South, he was a crazy killer. The fighting in Kansas showed the growing anger in Washington. In May 1856, Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts gave a strong speech called "The Crime Against Kansas," where he said very mean things about some Southern senators, including Andrew Butler from South Carolina. 2 days later, Butler's nephew, Congressman Preston Brooks, walked into the Senate room and hit Sumner over and over with a cane until he could not move. Sumner was hurt so badly that he could not come back to the Senate for more than 3 years, but his state kept his seat empty to show how mean the South was. The beating of Sumner became something both sides talked about. People in the North were shocked and said it was an attack on free speech and fair government. People in the South cheered Brooks as a protector of Southern pride and sent him many new canes. The event showed how talking calmly was breaking down and people were turning to fighting. The Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case in 1857 hurt the fight against slavery even more. Chief Justice Roger Taney said for the court that African Americans could never be citizens of the United States and that Congress could not stop slavery in new lands. The Missouri Compromise was now against the Constitution, and the government could not stop slavery anywhere. The decision was a huge shock. Republicans called it a plan to make slavery legal everywhere. Stephen Douglas had a hard time explaining how people could vote on slavery when the court said they could not stop it. Abraham Lincoln, still a not very famous lawyer and leader from Illinois, started to speak out strongly against the decision and what it meant. Lincoln's famous House divided speech when he accepted the Republican nomination for Senate in 1858 made clear the idea that slavery could not just be left half and half. A house divided against itself cannot stand, Lincoln said. I believe this government cannot last forever half slave and half free. I do not expect the country to break apart. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will stop being divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. The Lincoln-Douglas debates that came next during the 1858 Senate race got attention all over the country and made the slavery argument clear. Douglas said people should vote on slavery and tried to make Lincoln look like a dangerous person who wanted to end slavery fast. Lincoln carefully said he did not like slavery, but he had to follow the law, but he made it clear slavery was wrong and should not grow. Even though Lincoln lost the Senate race, the debates made him known everywhere and a top leader of the Republican Party. His clear, smart words against letting slavery grow, plus his clear skill, made him a good choice for something bigger. The country was getting ready for the election of 1860, which would decide not just who would be president, but if the country would stay together. The fall of 1859 brought something that pushed the country past the point where it could turn back. John Brown, the same man who had led the killings at Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, had been planning something much bigger and more dangerous. He dreamed of a huge slave rebellion that would spread across the South, freeing millions of enslaved people and ending slavery. Brown's plan was simple but very scary. He would take the government weapons building at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, give guns to local enslaved people, and make a safe place in the Blue Ridge Mountains to attack from all over the South. It was the worst fear of the South come true, and it would change things more than even Brown thought. On the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and 21 men, including 5 black men and 3 of his own sons, crossed the Potomac River and took the weapons building. They cut telephone wires, took some important local people as prisoners, and waited for enslaved people to come join them. But the big rebellion Brown hoped for never happened. Instead, local fighters surrounded the building, and soldiers sent by the government under Colonel Robert E. Lee came to stop it. The attack on the engine house, where Brown and his men were hiding, was quick and strong. 10 of Brown's men were killed, including 2 of his sons. Brown himself was hurt and caught with some others. The raid lasted less than 36 hours, but people would talk about it. For years, Brown's trial got attention from everyone. Lying on a bed in court, hurt but not giving up, he turned himself from a failed fighter into a hero for people against slavery. His last words to the court were powerful. "If I have to give my life to help justice, and mix my blood with the blood of my children and the blood of millions in this slave country, whose rights are ignored by evil and unfair laws, I say let it happen." The way people felt about Brown's raid and hanging showed how far apart North and South were. In the North, church bells rang on the day he was hanged, and people called him a hero who died for freedom. Ralph Waldo Emerson compared him to Jesus, and Henry David Thoreau called him an angel of light. In the South, Brown was seen as proof that crazy people in the North would do anything to ruin the South. The raid did something else important. It made many Southern people believe they could not trust the government to keep them safe. If a few people against slavery could take a government weapons building and try to start a slave rebellion, what would happen if the Republican Party that hated slavery took over the government? Many in the South thought it would destroy their whole life. As 1860 began, the Democratic Party, which had kept the country together for years with deals, started to break apart by sections. The party's big meeting in Charleston, South Carolina, turned into a fight between Northern Democrats led by Stephen Douglas and Southern Democrats who wanted the government to protect slavery in new lands. When they could not choose Douglas, Southern members walked out, and the party split into North and South parts. The Republican Party was getting stronger and more sure of itself. Started just 6 years before as a party against letting slavery grow, it had grown fast by talking to Northern people who did not want slavery to spread. The party's ideas for 1860 were made to bring many people together. No more slavery in new lands, a big railroad across the country, higher taxes on imports to help Northern factories, and free land for people moving west. The Republican meeting in Chicago was loud and exciting, with many men wanting to be chosen. William Seward from New York looked like he would win at first, but some thought he was too strong against slavery. Abraham Lincoln, the lawyer from the plains of Illinois, became the choice that many could agree on while still keeping the party against slavery growing. Lincoln being chosen sent fear through the South. Here was a man who said the country could not stay half slave and half free, who had argued with Stephen Douglas about how wrong slavery was, who was part of a party that wanted slavery to end someday. Southern newspapers called him a dangerous black Republican who would ruin the South. Some Southern states started getting ready to leave the country even before the voting happened. The election of 1860 was different from any before. 4 men were running for president: Lincoln for the Republicans, Douglas for the Northern Democrats, John Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats, and John Bell for the Constitutional Union Party. Lincoln's name was not even on the list of choices in 10 Southern states, showing how split the country was. Lincoln stayed home in Springfield, Illinois, greeting visitors, while his friends held big marches and meetings across the North. He did not say much during the campaign, letting his old speeches and the party ideas speak for him. Being quiet was smart. Anything he said could be changed by enemies to make him look too extreme. The results of the election were clear but worrying. Lincoln won a strong number of electoral votes with 180, but he got less than 40% of the total votes people cast, and almost no votes in the South. The election showed a country so split that no one could win both North and South. Things were not holding together, and the results would be terrible. South Carolina had been getting ready for this for months. Even before all votes were counted, the state leaders called for a meeting to leave the country. On December 20, 1860, people meeting in Charleston all voted to break away from the United States. South Carolina had started what would become a war that destroyed so much. South Carolina leaving was followed by many more in the Deep South. Mississippi left on January 9, 1861, then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By February 1, 7 states had left, and leaders were meeting in Montgomery, Alabama, to make a new country, the Confederate States of America. The Confederate meeting worked fast to make a government. They wrote a constitution mostly like the U.S. one, but with big changes. It clearly protected slavery, said the president could only serve one 6-year term, and gave more power to each state. Jefferson Davis from Mississippi, who went to West Point and was once a U.S. senator, was picked as president, with Alexander Stephens from Georgia as vice president. In his first speech, Stephens made clear what the Confederacy was about. The new country's main idea, he said, was the great truth that black people are not equal to white people, that slavery, being owned and ruled by the better race, was their natural place. There could not be a clearer way to say why the Confederacy started or the main problem that split the country. Meanwhile, in Washington, the old President James Buchanan tried to handle the trouble. Buchanan, from Pennsylvania but like the South, said leaving the country was against the law, but said the government could not stop it. Doing nothing let the Confederates take government buildings all over the South, like forts, weapon buildings, and tax offices. Abraham Lincoln, still waiting to become president, watched all this with worry. He had hoped his winning would not break the country, and he still believed most Southern people loved the United States. In his first speech as president on March 4, 1861, he tried to calm the South while saying he would keep the country together. "I have no plan, directly or not, to mess with slavery where it already is," Lincoln said. "I believe I have no legal right to do that, and I do not want to." But he also made clear he would not let states leave. No state can just decide on its own to leave the Union. The Union would last forever, and he would use all his power to keep it. Lincoln's words did not change minds in the South. The Confederates had already gone too far to come back because of a speech. They had made their own government, picked their own president, and wanted to be their own country. The only question left was if this could happen without fighting or if there would be war. The answer came at a small fort in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter, built on a man-made island. To protect the port had become a sign of government power right in the middle of the Confederacy. Major Robert Anderson, the fort's leader, had moved his small group of soldiers there from a weaker fort in December, making people in South Carolina angry because they saw it as a mean move. The fort was in a tough spot. Anderson had fewer than 80 men and not much food while Confederate soldiers surrounded the water. Lincoln had a very hard choice: send more supplies and maybe start a war, or give up the fort and look like he was letting the Confederates win. He picked a middle way, saying he would send food but no more soldiers to the fort. Confederate leaders saw this as the moment to decide. If they let government soldiers stay in Charleston Harbor, their talk of being free would mean nothing. On April 11, Confederate General P.G. Beauregard asked Anderson to give up. When Anderson said no, Beauregard told his guns to start shooting. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, a Confederate shell flew through the dark and blew up over Fort Sumter. The American Civil War had started. For 34 hours, Confederate cannons fired at the fort while Anderson's men shot back the best they could. Amazingly, no one died during the shooting, but the fort could not hold out. On April 13, Anderson gave up and the United States flag came down over Fort Sumter for the first time since the American Revolution. The attack on Fort Sumter excited the North. Lincoln right away asked for 75,000 volunteers to stop the rebellion, and men signed up faster than anyone thought they would. The war that many hoped to stop was now here, and both sides got ready for what they thought would be a quick fight. But the attack on Sumter also did something else. It made 4 more states join the Confederacy. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas had first said no to leaving, but Lincoln asking for soldiers to fight their sister states was too much. By June, 11 states were in the Confederacy, and the sides were set. The war that started at Fort Sumter would last 4 years and take more than 600,000 lives. It would change the United States from many states loosely together into one strong country, end slavery forever, and make the national government stronger than the states. But in April 1861, no one could see any of that. People on both sides thought they were fighting for what they believed was right, and they were ready to pay any cost to win. The spring of 1861 turned America overnight. From a country at peace to one getting ready for war. In the North, the attack on Fort Sumter had started a wave of love for the country not seen since the Revolution. Young men waited in long lines at sign-up places. Bands played happy marching music in town centers, and women started groups to sew clothes for the soldiers. The Union side felt right and winning seemed sure, but under all the excitement were some hard truths. The United States Army had fewer than 16,000 men, most out west fighting Native Americans. The Navy was small, and many of its leaders were from the South and had quit. The government had no plan for a big war, no way to get huge armies, and no practice handling a fight this large. Abraham Lincoln, suddenly president during the biggest trouble in American history, had never led even a small group of soldiers. His army time was a short period in the Black Hawk War 30 years before, where he saw no fighting and later joked his only enemies were mosquitoes. Yet this lawyer from the plains would have to learn how to lead a war while doing it, making choices about life and death for millions of people. The president's first big job was keeping the border states with the Union. Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware all had many people who liked the Confederacy, and losing them would be awful. If Maryland left, Washington, D.C. would be surrounded by enemy land. Kentucky controlled the Ohio River and a lot of the Mississippi. Missouri was the door to the west. Lincoln would have to use smart talking, army power, and bending rules a little to keep these states on his side. In Maryland, crowds who liked the Confederacy attacked Union soldiers passing through Baltimore on their way to protect Washington. Lincoln stopped the rule of habeas corpus and put people who wanted to leave in jail, even some state leaders. When Chief Justice Roger Taney said only Congress could stop habeas corpus, Lincoln paid no attention. The Constitution, Lincoln said, was not meant to let the country kill itself, and hard times needed hard actions. Kentucky was different. The state said it would stay neutral and not pick a side. Both Union and Confederate armies left it alone at first, but that could not last when Confederate soldiers took Columbus, Kentucky in September 1861. Union General Ulysses S. Grant quickly took Paducah and Cairo. Kentucky's neutral time was over, and the state stayed with the Union, though many of its men would fight for the South. Missouri fell into a small civil war inside the big Civil War. The governor who liked the Union, Claiborne Jackson, fought with pro-Confederate state soldiers, leading to battles at Wilson's Creek and Lexington. Fighting by small groups started all over the state with Confederate bushwhackers and Union Jayhawkers scaring people and burning towns. The fighting in Missouri would go on the whole war and after, leaving hurts that would take years to fix. While Lincoln worked to keep the Union together, Jefferson Davis had his own problems in Richmond, the new Confederate capital. The Confederacy had started fast, and its government was still being built. Davis, who went to West Point and was once Secretary of War, knew a lot about the Army, but he also had a hard personality and liked to control everything, which would cause trouble during the war. The Confederate Constitution gave more power to each state than the U.S. one, showing what Southern people believed about states' rights. But giving states so much power would make it hard to fight a war when fast choices and everyone working together were needed. The governor of Georgia, Joseph Brown, would fight with Davis a lot about making men join the Army and other national rules. The governor of South Carolina would not let his state's soldiers fight outside South Carolina. The Confederacy's love for states' rights would hurt its chance to win the war. Both sides had the huge job of building armies from nothing. The Union had big advantages in number of people, factories, and supplies, but they had to get all that ready and organized. The North had 22 million people while the South had 9 million, and almost 4 million of those were enslaved and could not fight. Northern factories could make guns, clothes, and tools, while the South had to buy from other countries or take things from the Union. The railroads showed the same difference. The North had more than 20,000 miles of track joining its cities and helping move soldiers and supplies. The South had only 9,000 miles of track, much of it not in good shape, and different sizes that did not connect well. The North's railroads would help them win, letting them move big armies fast and keep them supplied far away. But the South had good things too. It was fighting to protect its own land with people who knew the area. Shorter ways to move supplies and help from people living there. Southern men grew up with guns and horses and knew how to fight. Many of the best Army leaders, like Robert E. Lee, Albert Sidney Johnston, and Joseph E. Johnston, had quit the U.S. Army to join the Confederacy. The first big battle of the war came faster than anyone thought. People in the North wanted action and newspapers shouted, "On to Richmond." Lincoln's top general, Winfield Scott, wanted a slower plan of closing Southern ports and taking the Mississippi River, but people pushing him made him let an attack on the Confederate capital go ahead. General Irwin McDowell led 35,000 Union soldiers south from Washington toward the Confederate Army waiting near Manassas Junction, Virginia. The Confederates under General P.G.T. Beauregard had about 20,000 men, but they were waiting for more soldiers from the Shenandoah Valley under General Joseph E. Johnston. Everything was ready for the first big battle of the Civil War. On July 21, 1861, the two armies met along Bull Run Creek in what people called the First Battle of Bull Run or First Manassas to the Confederates. People from Washington, even members of Congress and their families, rode out in carriages to watch the battle, thinking they would see a fast Union win that would end the rebellion. The battle started well for the Union. McDowell's surprise attack pushed the Confederates back, and for hours it looked like the Union would win, but more Confederate soldiers came by train, and a Virginia group under Colonel Thomas J. Jackson stood strong against many Union attacks. Someone shouted, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall," giving Jackson the name that would make him famous. As the day went on, things turned bad for the Union. New Confederate soldiers attacked hard and broke the Union lines. What started as a calm pullback quickly became a messy run, with Union soldiers rushing back to Washington in fear. The people who came to watch the battle got caught in the running away, their carriages blocking roads and making everything worse. The loss at Bull Run was a big wake-up for the North. The war would not end in a few months, like many thought. The Confederate Army was not just a group of angry people, but a strong fighting group. Lincoln knew he needed a bigger army, better leaders, and a plan for a long time to win the war. The president chose General George B. McClellan, a young leader who had won some small fights in Western Virginia. McClellan was great at organizing and training soldiers, and he quickly turned the group of volunteers around Washington into a real army. He trained them hard, made their equipment and food better, and gave them pride and order. The Army of the Potomac, as it was called, would become one of the best fighting groups in American history. But McClellan had a big weakness. He was too careful and always thought the enemy was stronger than they were. He thought he faced twice as many Confederates as he really did, and he did not want to attack unless he had way more men. This being careful made Lincoln angry and made the war last longer, but it also kept the Union from losing very badly early in the war. While McClellan trained his army, the war grew in other places. In the West, Union soldiers under General Nathaniel Lyon were beaten at Wilson's Creek in Missouri, and Lyon was killed in the fight. Confederate soldiers moved into Kentucky, trying to bring that important state to their side. Sea fights started along the coast as the Union tried to close southern ports. The closing of ports, part of General Scott's Anaconda Plan, was meant to hurt the Confederacy's money by stopping trade with Europe. The South needed to sell cotton to pay for the war and buy guns, bullets, and other things. If the Union could close the ports, it could slowly stop the rebellion, but closing the ports was very hard. The southern coast was 3,500 miles long and had many harbors and small openings. The Union Navy had only 42 ships ready at the start of the war, and many were old sailing ships. Making a good closing would take growing the Navy a lot and making new kinds of ships. The first big win came at Hatteras Inlet in North Carolina, where a team of Army and Navy took 2 Confederate forts in August 1861. The win gave the Union a place on the southern coast and showed how well Army and Navy could work together. More wins like that would come, slowly closing the circle around the Confederacy. The war also became about other countries, as both sides tried to get help from Europe. The Confederacy hoped Europe needed southern cotton so much that Britain and France would help them. The Union tried to stop other countries from saying the Confederacy was real and keep them out of the war. The biggest trouble came in November 1861 with the Trent Affair. A Union warship stopped the British mail ship Trent and took 2 Confederate men, James Mason and John Slidell, who were going to Europe to ask for help for the Confederacy. The British people were very angry about breaking the rules of neutral ships and asked for the men back and for the U.S. to say sorry. For a few weeks, war between the United States and Britain looked possible. The British sent soldiers to Canada and got their ships ready to fight, but calmer people won and Lincoln's team let the men go and said sorry for what happened. One war at a time, Lincoln is said to have told people, knowing the Union could not fight the Confederacy and the British at the same time. As 1861 ended, both sides got ready for what was clearly going to be a long and bloody fight. The first excitement about war had turned into a serious plan to keep going no matter what. Families were already crying for their dead, and the money cost of the war was growing, but there was no way to go back now. The choice had been made, and the future of the country would be decided on the battlefields in the years ahead. The winter of 1861-1862 was a time to get ready and make plans. Both armies used the quiet months to train new soldiers, get supplies, and plan what to do next. In Washington, Lincoln had to handle the huge job of being leader during war, dealing with generals who wanted things, angry politicians, and people who wanted fast wins. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis had the same kind of problems, plus the Confederacy's weak Maine government and the need to build a country while fighting a war. Everything was ready for the big fights of 1862, which would make the war bigger and harder. New machines would be used, new plans would be tried, and new heroes would appear. The American Civil War was about to become its bloodiest time, and the country would never be the same. The year 1862 started with both armies ready to move after months of training. The Union had used the winter to grow its armies and make a full plan to win. The Confederacy had made its defenses stronger and got ready for what its leaders knew would be a hard fight to stay alive. In the Western theater, a not very famous Union general named Ulysses S. Grant was about to become important in history. Grant had a hard time making money after leaving West Point, failing at farming and selling things before the war gave him another chance. But he had things that would make him one of the best leaders in American history: strong will, smart plans, and knowing that war was really about breaking the enemy's desire to keep fighting. Grant's first big win came at Fort Henry on the Tennessee River in February 1862. The fort was built in a bad place and fell fast to Union boats with guns, opening the Tennessee River to Union boats. More importantly, it let Grant attack Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, which controlled the way to Nashville, the Confederate capital of Tennessee. The fight at Fort Donelson became Grant's first real test as a leader. The Confederate soldiers, led by Grant's old friend from West Point, Simon Bolivar Buckner, were trapped and would lose. When Buckner asked what the terms would be, Grant's answer became famous: "No terms except. An unconditional and immediate surrender will be accepted. I plan to attack your position right away." The fall of Fort Donelson was a terrible loss for the Confederacy. Nashville fell without a fight, and Confederate soldiers had to move back across Tennessee. Grant became a hero across the country overnight, getting the name Unconditional Surrender Grant. More importantly, the win opened the door for Union soldiers to go deep into the heart of the Confederacy, but Grant's hardest fight was still coming. In April 1862, Confederate soldiers under Albert Sidney Johnston made a surprise attack on Grant's army at Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, near a little church called Shiloh. The attack caught the Union soldiers totally by surprise, and for a while it looked like the Confederates might win a big victory. The Battle of Shiloh was different from anything Americans had seen before. The fighting was fierce and mixed up with groups getting lost in thick woods and shooting their own men by mistake. General Johnston, one of the best Confederate leaders, was killed early in the fight, bleeding to death from a leg wound that he might have lived through with better help. Grant's army was pushed back to the Tennessee River, and many of his leaders told him to run away, but Grant would not quit. Run away. He is said to have answered, "No, I plan to attack at dawn and beat them." Helped by General Don Carlos Buell's army during the night, Grant attacked back the next morning and pushed the Confederates off the field. The number of dead and hurt at Shiloh was huge, over 13,000 Union and almost 11,000 Confederate. It was the bloodiest battle in America until then, and it showed both sides how bad the killing would get. Grant was blamed for being surprised, but Lincoln stood up for him. "I can't lose this man, he fights." While Grant was winning in the West, things in the East were still hard for the Union. General McClellan had spent months training and getting the Army of the Potomac ready, but he did not want to use it. Lincoln got more and more angry with McClellan's waiting and reasons, famously writing, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a while." Finally, in March 1862, McClellan started his Peninsula Campaign, taking his army by ship to the Virginia Peninsula and moving toward Richmond from the southeast. The plan was good an idea, but McClellan's doing it was hurt by his usual too much careful way and thinking the enemy was stronger than they were. The Peninsula Campaign started well with Union soldiers moving close enough to see Richmond's church towers, but McClellan waited to give the final attack, sure he was outnumbered by Confederates who were really fewer than his army. This waiting gave the Confederates time to build defenses and bring more men. The Confederate protection of Richmond got harder when the leader changed. General Joseph E. Johnston, who had been leading Confederate soldiers on the peninsula, was hurt at the Battle of Seven Pines at the end of May. Jefferson Davis put Robert E. Lee in charge, a choice that would change the war. Lee was 55 years old and had worked most of his life as an engineer and helper. He had not wanted the South to leave and had been offered the top Union Army job at the start of the war, but his love for Virginia made him quit the U.S. Army and join the Confederacy. Many people were not sure about Davis picking Lee because he had not done great things in his fights in Western Virginia and South Carolina, but Lee would turn out to be a genius at war, maybe the best fighter in American history. He knew the Confederacy could not win a long fight against the bigger and richer North. Instead, he would have to take chances, use brave plans, and hope to win big battles that would make the North give up and maybe get help from other countries. Lee's first big move was the 7 Days Battles, a set of attacks on McClellan's army at the end of June 1862. The battles cost many lives on both sides, but Lee got what he wanted by making McClellan pull back from Richmond. The Peninsula Campaign, which had promised so much, ended as a loss for the Union. McClellan's pulling back was a big letdown to Lincoln and the people in the North. The general, who had been called the young Napoleon, had failed to take Richmond even with every good thing on his side. Lincoln started to trust McClellan less. Though he would give him one more chance, the failure of the Peninsula Campaign changed how the Union would fight. It was clear the war would not be won fast or easy, and the Union would have to use all its power for a long fight. Congress passed the first law in American history to make men join the army. But it let rich men pay someone else to go or pay $300 to get out of it, making people say it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. The war was also starting to change American life in big ways. The needs of the fighting were breaking old rules and giving new chances to people who had been pushed aside. Women started working as nurses, factory workers, and even spies, the famous nurse Clara Barton would later start the American Red Cross because of what she did in the Civil War. African Americans, both free and enslaved, saw the war as a chance to fight for freedom. Thousands of enslaved people ran to Union Army lines where they were called contraband and used to help the war. Free black men in the North asked to join the army, though they would not be allowed until later in the war. The question of slavery was becoming more and more important to the whole war. Strong Republicans in Congress pushed to free the slaves, saying slavery was the real reason for the rebellion and it had to be ended to have real peace. Lincoln was slower, afraid that moving too fast on slavery would push the border states to the Confederacy and make Northern Democrats who did not like change angry. But things were pushing Lincoln to act. The war was lasting longer and costing more than anyone thought it would. If the Union was going to ask people to give so much, it needed a bigger and better reason than just keeping things the same. Freeing the slaves would give the war a reason people could feel proud of that would bring the North together and stop Europe from helping the South. Confederacy. The military situation also made emancipation a good idea. Enslaved people were a very important resource for the Confederacy. They worked in fields and factories, while white men fought in the army. If the Union could turn this resource against the Confederacy by promising freedom to enslaved people, it would hurt the Southern war effort very badly. Lincoln started writing an Emancipation Proclamation in the summer of 1862, but his advisors told him to wait for a military victory before he announced it. A proclamation given out after a defeat would look like an act of desperation. One given out after a victory would look like it came from a position of strength. The chance came sooner than expected. Encouraged by his success in defending Richmond, Lee decided to take the war to the North. In September 1862, he led his army across the Potomac River into Maryland. He hoped to win a big victory on Northern ground that would bring European countries to recognize the Confederacy and maybe end the war. Lee's invasion of Maryland was a risky gamble. His army was tired and badly supplied after months of fighting, and many of his men were barefoot and wearing rags. But Lee believed that a victory in Maryland could change the whole course of the war. European countries were watching closely, and a Confederate victory on Northern ground might make them recognize Southern independence. The campaign started well for Lee. His army crossed into Maryland without anyone stopping them, and he gave out a proclamation asking Marylanders to join the Confederate cause. But Lee's plans fell apart when a copy of his orders was found by Union soldiers. It was wrapped around 3 cigars and left at an empty Confederate camp. The lost orders showed that Lee had split his army. He sent part of it to capture the Union fort at Harper's Ferry, while the rest moved north. McClellan for once moved quickly to use this information. He marched fast to attack Lee's split forces. The two armies met at Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland on September 17, 1862. The Battle of Antietam would turn out to be the bloodiest single day in American history, with more than 23,000 men killed or wounded. Fighting was fierce and confusing. Both sides made desperate attacks and counterattacks across the rolling Maryland countryside. The battle started at dawn with a Union attack on the Confederate left side near Dunkirk Church. The fighting moved back and forth through the cornfields. Whole regiments were shot down in minutes. The 1st Texas Infantry went into the battle with 226 men and came out with only 40. The corn was cut down as if by a huge knife, and the field was covered with bodies, the center of the Confederate line had a sunken road that became known as Bloody Lane after Union forces finally broke through and filled it with Confederate dead. The Confederate right side was held at Antietam Creek, where a narrow stone bridge became the target of many Union attacks. The bridge, later renamed Burnside Bridge to honor the battle, was finally taken after hours of fighting. Even though they lost many men, Lee's army held its ground all day. But the Confederate position was dangerous, with the army backed up to the Potomac River and no way to retreat. That night, Lee made the hard decision to pull back into Virginia, ending the Maryland campaign. Antietam was a strategic victory for the Union. Even though McClellan failed to chase and destroy Lee's retreating army, the Confederate invasion had been stopped. European countries put off recognizing the Confederacy forever. And Lincoln finally had the victory he needed to give the Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln announced that all enslaved people in areas still fighting against the Union on January 1, 1863 would be free forever. The proclamation was written carefully so it would not upset the border states. It only applied to areas controlled by the Confederacy, but its meaning as a symbol was huge. It changed the war from a fight about keeping the Union together to a crusade for human freedom. People reacted to the Emancipation Proclamation in different ways. Abolitionists praised it as a great step forward. Conservatives criticized it as against the Constitution and too extreme. In the South, it was called an invitation to slave rebellions and proof of Northern madness, but the proclamation reached its main goals. It lifted Northern spirits, stopped European countries from helping the South, and started turning the war into a fight for what was right. The proclamation also made it possible for African American men to serve in the army. Free black men in the North had been trying to join since the beginning of the war, but they had been turned away. Now, with emancipation and official rule, the Union started signing up black soldiers seriously. By the end of the war, almost 200,000 African Americans would serve in the Union Army and Navy. They played a key part in winning their own freedom. The year 1862 ended with mixed results for both sides. The Union had made big gains in the West. They captured New Orleans, Memphis, and much of Tennessee. But in the East, the Army of the Potomac had suffered a terrible defeat at Fredericksburg in December, where Ambrose Burnside, who had taken McClellan's place, made useless frontal attacks against strong Confederate positions. The Battle of Fredericksburg was a massacre with more than 12,000 Union men killed or wounded compared to fewer than 5,000 Confederates. The defeat was so total that Confederate General James Longstreet later wrote, "The Federals had been throwing men away so carelessly that I began to think they had an endless supply." The battle ruined Burnside's reputation and left the Army of the Potomac discouraged and without good leaders. As 1863 began, both sides got ready for what they knew would be the most important year of the war. The Union had the money and men to win, but it needed better leaders and a clearer plan. The Confederacy was running out of men and supplies, but it still had great generals and the advantage of fighting on its own land. The stage was set for the battles that would decide the future of the country. The winter of 1862 to 1863 was a time of crisis and deep worry for the Union. The Army of the Potomac, hurt and discouraged after the disaster at Fredericksburg, stayed in winter camps across the Rappahannock River from Lee's. Confederates, many soldiers deserted. Some regiments lost half their men who just walked away from the war. Abraham Lincoln faced the darkest time of his presidency. The Emancipation Proclamation had been given out, but its good effects were not clear yet. Democrats had won many seats in the midterm elections. They ran on promises of peace and compromise. Radical Republicans blamed Lincoln for not fighting the war hard enough, while conservative Democrats said he had turned the war into a fight to end slavery that would never stop. The president's own family life was also full of trouble. His wife Mary was struggling with mental sickness made worse by the death of their son, Willie, from typhoid fever in February 1862. Lincoln himself was feeling the heavy weight of leading the country. His face grew thinner and more lined every month. Visitors to the White House were shocked by how tired and sad he looked. They said he seemed like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But Lincoln's biggest problem was finding generals who could beat Robert E. Lee's smart battle plans. Ambrose Burnside, the newest in a line of failed commanders of the Army of the Potomac, had shown he was not good enough at Fredericksburg. His replacement, Joseph Hooker, was a hard-drinking, proud general known as Fighting Joe. He promised to lift the Army's spirits and win big victories. Hooker did succeed in making the Army stronger during the winter months. He fixed the supply system, gave time off to soldiers who earned it, and rebuilt the cavalry into a strong fighting force. By spring, the Army of the Potomac was bigger and better equipped than ever before, with more than 130,000 men ready to fight. Hooker's plan for the spring campaign was smart and bold. He would leave a third of his army to keep Lay's forces busy at Fredericksburg, while he took the rest on a wide circling movement through the wilderness of Spotsylvania. This would force Lee to leave his strong defense positions and fight on ground Hooker picked. It was exactly the kind of brave, attacking plan that Lincoln had been waiting to see. The campaign started well in late April 1863. Hooker's circling force crossed the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers without anyone stopping them and gathered near a crossroads inn called Chancellorsville. Lee was surprised by the move and seemed to be in a very bad position, attacked from two sides by a much larger army. But Lee's answer to the danger showed why he was thought of as one of history's greatest military leaders. Instead of pulling back or trying to defend everywhere, he made the brave decision to split his already smaller army. He left a small force to watch the Union troops at Fredericksburg. He marched the main part of his army west to face Hooker at Chancellorsville. The Battle of Chancellorsville began on May 1, 1863, when Lee's advance soldiers met Hooker's forces coming out of the wilderness. To everyone's surprise, Hooker ordered his men to pull back into defense positions. He gave up the advantage to Lee. Fighting Joe had lost his courage at the most important moment, and Lee was quick to use it. That evening, Lee made an even braver decision. From information given by local people, he learned that the Union right side was open, with no protection and easy to attack. He decided to split his army again. He sent Stonewall Jackson with 26,000 men on a 12-mile march around the Union side, while he kept Hooker's attention with the remaining 17,000. Jackson's circling march on May 2 was one of the boldest moves in military history. For hours, his long line of men moved through the thick woods of the wilderness, using hidden paths and logging roads. Union lookouts saw parts of the line and told Hooker, but the Union commander thought Lee was running away and did nothing to stop it. Late in the afternoon, Jackson's men came out of the woods and lined up for attack. The Union 11th Corps, made up mostly of German immigrants, was not ready at all for what hit them. Many of the soldiers were cooking supper or playing cards when the Confederate rebel yell rang through the forest and thousands of gray-uniformed soldiers rushed from the trees. The attack was crushing. The whole 11th Corps broke and ran in panic, rushing back through the woods in total confusion. Jackson's men chased hard, pushing back the Union line and almost cutting off Hooker's whole army. For a few hours, it looked like Lee might win the greatest victory of the war, but tragedy hit the Confederate side at the moment of its biggest success. Jackson, riding ahead in the dark to look at the Union positions, was shot by his own men who thought his group was Union cavalry. The wounds were bad, needing his left arm to be cut off, and Jackson would die of pneumonia 8 days later, the loss of Stonewall. Jackson was a terrible blow to the Confederacy. Lee called him his right arm, and his death took away the Confederate Army's most daring and skilled corps commander. "I have lost my right arm," Lee said when he heard of Jackson's death. "But you have lost your left," Jackson is said to have answered, talking about his cut-off arm. Even with Jackson hurt, the Battle of Chancellorsville went on for 2 more days. Lee kept attacking Hooker's discouraged forces while also fighting a Union attack on his rear guard at Fredericksburg. It was a perfect example of battlefield skill, with Lee managing to beat forces twice the size of his own army. Hooker, completely beaten and maybe hurt from a Confederate cannon shell that hit his headquarters, ordered a retreat across the Rappahannock. The Army of the Potomac had suffered another embarrassing defeat, losing more than 17,000 men while causing only 13,000 casualties to Lee's army. It was Lee's greatest victory, but it cost him officers and men he could never replace. The victory at Chancellorsville made Lee sure that the time was right for another invasion of the North. The Army of Northern Virginia was at the height of its strength, having just beaten a much bigger Union force. Northern spirits were low, and more people were calling for peace talks. A big victory on Northern ground might bring European recognition, help Northern peace Democrats, and maybe end the war the way the Confederacy wanted. Lee's second invasion of the North began in June 1863, with his army moving through the Shenandoah Valley into Maryland and Pennsylvania. Confederate march caused panic in the North, with local militia called out and government leaders getting ready to leave Washington and Harrisburg. For the first time since the Revolution, an enemy army was marching through Pennsylvania. The invasion also made Lincoln change the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Again, Hooker, still upset from his defeat at Chancellorsville, argued with the War Department about the fort at Harper's Ferry and offered his resignation. To his surprise, Lincoln took it, replacing him with General George Gordon Meade, a good but not exciting corps commander. Meade had only 3 days to take command of the army and chase Lee into Pennsylvania. It was a hard job made worse by the fact that neither army knew exactly where the other one was. Lee's cavalry under J.E.B. Stuart had gone off on a ride around the Union Army and could not send messages, leaving Lee with no idea of Union movements. The two armies ran into each other by accident at the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg on July 1, 1863. Neither commander had planned to fight there, but the meeting of advance groups quickly grew into a big battle. The town was at the crossing of several roads, making it important, and both sides sent more soldiers to the area fast. The first day of fighting went well for the Confederates. They pushed Union forces through the town and onto the high ground south of Gettysburg, including Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, but Lee's officers did not push hard enough, letting the Union forces set up strong defense positions on what became known as the Fishhook Line. That evening, both armies brought all their forces together for what everyone knew would be a deciding battle. Lee had about 75,000 men, while Meade commanded about 90,000. The Union position was strong, on high ground with good places to shoot from. But Lee was sure that his experienced soldiers could break through anywhere he decided to attack. The second day of the battle, July 2, saw Lee try to attack both ends of the Union line. James Longstreet's corps attacked the Union left at Little Round Top in the wheat field, while Richard Ewell's corps attacked the Union right at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. The fighting was fierce, with both sides losing huge numbers of men, but the Union line held. The hero of Little Round Top was Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Infantry. When his regiment ran out of bullets during repeated Confederate attacks, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge that stopped the Confederate attack and saved the Union left side. His actions would win him the Medal of Honor and make him one of the most famous heroes of the war. Lee's attacks on the second day had come very close to winning, but they finally failed. A weaker general might have pulled back, but Lee was sure that one more attack would break the Union line. He decided to attack the center of the Union position on Cemetery Ridge, thinking that Meade had made his center weaker to strengthen his sides. The third day of Gettysburg, July 3, began with a huge cannon attack meant to weaken the Union center. For 2 hours, 150 Confederate cannons fired at the Union positions on Cemetery Ridge in what was probably the biggest cannon attack ever seen in North America. The Union cannons fired back, and the noise of the cannon fire could be heard 25 miles away. When the cannon fire slowed down, 15,000 Confederate soldiers under General George Pickett started their march across the open fields towards Cemetery Ridge. It was a beautiful and awful sight. Long lines of gray-uniformed soldiers marching in perfect order toward the Union positions, their battle flags waving and their officers on horses easy to see. But Pickett's charge, as it became known, was doomed from the beginning. The Union cannons had not been stopped. And as the Confederate lines moved forward, they were ripped apart by cannon balls and grape shot. Union soldiers, protected by stone walls and dirt banks, fired deadly shots into the moving ranks. Only a few hundred Confederates reached the Union line, and they were quickly pushed back. The failure of Pickett's charge marked the high point of the Confederacy. Lee's army had lost more than 28,000 men in 3 days of fighting, losses it could not replace. The Army of Northern Virginia would never again be strong enough to invade the North or win a big victory. The war had reached its turning point. Lee took full blame for the defeat. He told his men, "It is all my fault." He offered to quit to Jefferson Davis, but the Confederate president would not let him. there was no one else who could lead the Army of Northern Virginia, and Davis knew that Lee's leadership was needed for the Confederate cause, even after a loss. Meade's failure to chase and destroy Lee's retreating army was a big disappointment to Lincoln. The president believed that the war could have ended at Gettysburg if Meade had been more aggressive. "We had them in our grasp," Lincoln said. "We only had to reach out our hands, and they were ours." But Meade, like so many Union generals before him, was happy with a defensive victory and let the chance slip away. The Battle of Gettysburg was not the only Union victory in July 1863. On July 4, the same day Lee started his retreat from Pennsylvania, Ulysses Grant finally captured Vicksburg, Mississippi after a siege that lasted 47 days. The fall of Vicksburg gave the Union full control of the Mississippi River. It split the Confederacy in two and cut off Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the South. The siege of Vicksburg had been a perfect example of planning and supply work. Grant had tried several ways to reach the city, which sat on high bluffs above the Mississippi River and was thought to be impossible to take. Finally, he marched his army down the west side of the river, crossed below the city, and attacked Vicksburg from the back, cutting it off from help and supplies. The siege had been terrible for the civilians trapped in Vicksburg. Confederate and Union cannons had fired at the city day and night, forcing people to live in caves dug into the hills. Food had run out, and people had been forced to eat rats, mules, and shoe leather. When the city finally gave up, the soldiers were starving, and the people were close to breaking down. Grant's victory at Vicksburg made him the most successful Union general and caught Lincoln's eye as a possible leader for all Union armies. Unlike the careful generals who had led in the East, Grant knew that the war was about breaking the enemy's power to fight, not just winning battles. He was ready to lose many men if it meant getting deciding results. The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the start of the end for the Confederacy. The South had lost its best chance to win the war by fighting, and the Union was finally using its greater strength well. But the war was far from over, and the Confederacy would keep fighting with desperate bravery for almost 2 more years. The summer of 1863 also saw the first big use of African American troops in battle. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first black regiments raised in the North, led an attack on Fort Wagner in Charleston Harbor on July 18. The attack failed and the regiment lost many men, including its white colonel, Robert Goode Shaw. But the bravery shown by the 54th Massachusetts helped change Northern feelings about black soldiers. Frederick Douglass had said that serving in the Army would be the key to full citizenship for African Americans, and the actions of black troops in battle proved he was right. By the end of the war, black soldiers would make up 10% of the Union Army and would play a very important part in winning their own freedom. The year 1863 ended with mixed results for both sides. The Union had won big victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, but it had also lost battles at Chickamauga and Chancellorsville. The Confederacy was clearly on the defense, but it still had strong armies and determined leaders. The war would go on, but the advantage had clearly moved to the Union. As 1864 began, Lincoln faced a presidential election that would decide not just his own future, but the future of the Union cause. If he lost, the next president might make peace that would let the Confederacy become its own country and keep slavery. Everything depended on the battles of the coming year and the Union's power to end the war successfully. The start of 1864 found Abraham Lincoln facing the biggest challenge of his presidency. The war had gone on for almost 3 years, taking hundreds of thousands of lives and billions of dollars. Northern spirits were low, and the coming presidential election looked like it could be a disaster for the Republican Party and the Union cause. Lincoln knew that he needed big military victories to keep people supporting the war. The president's search for a general who could match Robert E. Lee's battlefield skill finally ended with Ulysses Grant. The winner of Vicksburg had shown that he understood modern war. It was not enough to win battles. You had to destroy the enemy's power to keep fighting. In March 1864, Lincoln made Grant general and leader of all Union armies, giving him never-before-seen power to run the war effort. Grant's plan for 1864 was simple but strong. Put pressure everywhere at the same time, keeping the Confederates from moving soldiers to meet dangers. While he went with the Army of the Potomac in its march on Richmond, William Tecumseh Sherman would march from Tennessee toward Atlanta. Nathaniel Banks would move up the Red River in Louisiana, and Benjamin Butler would attack Richmond from the south by the James River. The plan was a big change in Union strategy. Past campaigns had been separate efforts with armies working alone and often against each other. Grant knew that the Union's greatest strength was its larger numbers, but this strength could only be used through planned teamwork. The Confederacy would have to fight on many fronts at once, stretching its few resources until they broke. Grant's first test came in the thick wilderness of Spotsylvania County, Virginia, where Lee had beaten Hooker the year before. The Battle of the Wilderness, fought on May 5 and 6, 1864, was a confusing and bloody fight in thick woods that canceled the Union's advantages in cannons and numbers. Soldiers fought close up, often unable to see their enemies through the heavy bushes. The battle was a battlefield win for Lee, who caused more losses to Grant than he lost himself. But Grant's answer to the loss showed why he was different from earlier Union commanders. Instead of pulling back across the Rappahannock, as his earlier leaders had done, Grant ordered his army to keep moving south, trying to get between Lee and Richmond. The soldiers of the Army of the Potomac, used to retreating after every fight with Lee, were shocked when they realized they were moving forward. Cheers went up along the marching lines as word spread that unconditional surrender. Grant was not giving up. For the first time in the war, Lee was forced to follow Union moves instead of deciding what happened. The two armies raced toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, with Lee's forces getting there just in time to stop Grant's move. The fighting that followed lasted for 2 weeks, with both sides building long dirt walls and having some of the fiercest battles of the war. The worst moment came on May 12 at a sticking-out part of the Confederate line known as the Bloody Angle, where men fought hand-to-hand for 20 hours. The fighting at the Bloody Angle was so bad that a 22-inch oak tree was cut down by bullets alone. Soldiers fought with bayonets, rifle ends, and even their fists in trenches full of mud and blood. One man who was there called it the most terrible 20 hours in the history of fighting, and the dead were piled 3 deep in some places. Grant's losses in the Wilderness and Spotsylvania fights were huge, more than 36,000 men in less than 2 weeks. Northern newspapers started calling him the Butcher, and there were calls to remove him. But Lincoln supported his general, knowing that Grant was finally putting the kind of pressure that could break the Confederacy's will to fight. The campaign went on with the Battle of Cold Harbor on June 3, where Grant ordered a direct attack on Lee's dug-in positions that caused 7,000 Union losses in less than an hour. It was Grant's worst battlefield mistake, and he later wrote that he was sorry he ordered the attack. But even this disaster did not stop him from his main goal, destroying Lee's army. Unable to break through Lee's defenses, Grant made a smart move, taking his whole army across the James River to attack Petersburg, the railroad center that supplied Richmond. If Petersburg fell, the Confederate capital could not be held, and Lee's army would be forced to retreat or starve. The move surprised Lee and almost worked, but Confederate help arrived just in time to save the city. The failure to take Petersburg right away led to a siege that would last 10 months. Both armies dug long trench systems that stretched for miles around the city, giving a look ahead at the Western Front. In World War I, trench fighting was a new thing for American soldiers who had to learn to live in muddy trenches under constant danger from snipers and cannons. While Grant was wearing down Lee's army in Virginia, Sherman was leading his own campaign in Georgia. The march to Atlanta was a perfect example of moving warfare, with Sherman using his larger numbers to go around Confederate positions instead of attacking them head-on. General Joseph E. Johnston, leading Confederate forces in Georgia, led a skillful fighting retreat, but he could not stop Sherman's advance. Jefferson Davis, angry at Johnston's defensive plan, replaced him with John Bell Hood, a brave general who had lost a leg at Chickamauga. Hood right away went on the attack, starting a series of attacks on Sherman's forces around Atlanta. But Hood's attacks were badly planned and expensive failures that hurt his army without gaining anything important. Sherman's capture of Atlanta on September 2, 1864, was a very important victory for the Union cause. The city was a big factory center and railroad center, and its loss hurt Confederate spirits badly. More importantly for Lincoln, the victory came just 2 months before the presidential election and helped make sure he would win again. The Democratic Party had chosen George B. McClellan, Grant's earlier commander of the Army of the Potomac, on a plan calling for an immediate ceasefire and peace talks. McClellan himself was not a peace candidate, but his running mate and many of his supporters wanted to end the war, even if it meant letting the Confederacy go free. Lincoln's re-election was not certain. The war had lasted much longer than anyone thought, and the losses were growing every day. Riots against the draft had broken out in New York City the year before, and many working-class Democrats were against the war because they did not want to fight to free enslaved people who might take their jobs. But Sherman's victory at Atlanta changed the political picture. Suddenly, it looked like the Union was winning the war, and voters did not want to change leaders at such an important time. Lincoln won a clear victory, winning all but 3 states and getting 55% of the popular vote. The election was a vote on the war, and the American people had chosen to keep fighting until victory. Lincoln's re-election made sure that the war would go on until the Confederacy was fully beaten and slavery was ended. In his second inaugural address given on March 4, 1865, Lincoln spoke of bringing the country together while making clear he would finish the work of freedom. With hatred toward no one, with kindness for everyone, he said, "Let us work to finish the job we are in to heal the nation's wounds." But before the country could come together, the Confederacy had to be completely beaten. Sherman's march to the sea, which started after the fall of Atlanta, was planned to break the South's will to keep fighting. Sherman's 60,000 men cut a path of destruction 60 miles wide across Georgia, destroying railroads, factories, and anything else that could help the Confederate war effort. The march was argued about, even among Union supporters who questioned if it was right to make war on civilians. But Sherman believed that the South's civilian people were as much a part of the war as its soldiers, and that breaking their spirits was needed to end the fighting. "War is hell," he famously said, and he was set to make the South feel the full pain of that hell. Sherman's army reached Savannah on December 21, 1864, finishing a march of 300 miles in just over a month. The city gave up without a fight, and Sherman sent Lincoln a telegram. "I beg to give you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 heavy cannons and plenty of ammunition, also about 25,000 bales of cotton." The march to the sea was followed by an even worse campaign through South Carolina, the state that had begun the war. Sherman's men, many of whom blamed South Carolina for the war, were especially hard on the state. Columbia, the state capital, was burned, though people still argue if it was on purpose or by accident. The destruction of South Carolina marked the start of the end for the Confederacy. Lee's army was stuck in the trenches around Petersburg, slowly starving and losing men. Johnston's army in North Carolina was too weak to stop Sherman's march. The Confederate government was getting ready to leave Richmond, and some talked of keeping the war going as guerrillas in the mountains. But Lee knew that more fighting would only bring more pain to the South. His army was down to fewer than 30,000 good men, many of them barefoot and hungry. More soldiers were deserting every day as men slipped away to go home to their families. The cause was lost, and Lee knew it. The end came quickly in April 1865. Grant's final attack broke through Lee's lines at Petersburg, forcing the Confederate army to leave its positions and try to move west. But Union cavalry and foot soldiers cut off Lee's escape paths. And on April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered his army to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The surrender meeting was done with respect and honor for the beaten Confederates. Grant told his men not to cheer, saying, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." Lee's soldiers were allowed to keep their horses and personal guns, and they were given food from Union supplies. It was a kind peace that showed Lincoln's wish for the country to come back together, but Lincoln would not live to see the results of his kindness. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, the president was shot by actor John Wilkes Booth while watching a play at Ford's Theater. Lincoln died the next morning, becoming a martyr to the cause of Union and freedom that he had led through the war. The killing of Lincoln was a tragedy for the country and especially for the South. Lincoln had wanted a gentle rebuilding policy that would have quickly brought the Southern states back into the Union with little punishment. His successor, Andrew Johnson, did not have Lincoln's political skill and moral strength, and the rebuilding years would be full of anger and fighting that lasted for generations. The American Civil War officially ended on May 26, 1865, when the last Confederate forces gave up. The cost had been huge. More than 600,000 dead, millions more wounded, and whole areas of the country ruined. But the Union had been saved, slavery had been ended, and the United States had become a modern nation with a strong federal government. The war had changed American society in basic ways. The federal government had taken powers that would have been unthinkable before the war, including the right to draft soldiers, print paper money, and control the economy. The factory power that had been built up to help the war effort would fuel America's rise as a world power in the years to come. For African Americans, the war had brought freedom, but not equality. The 13th Amendment had ended slavery, and the 14th and 15th Amendments would promise citizenship and voting rights. But the promises of rebuilding would be broken by the Compromise of 1877, which ended federal protection for black rights in return for Republican control of the presidency. The Civil War had answered the questions that had bothered the nation since its beginning. The Union was permanent, and slavery could not exist with American ideas of freedom and equality. But it had also brought new questions about the role of government, the meaning of citizenship, and the nature of American democracy that would keep challenging the nation for generations to come. Spring of 1865 found the Confederacy dying, though few wanted to admit it. Richmond, the proud capital of the rebellion, had become a city under attack, its streets filled with refugees, wounded soldiers, and the scared families of Confederate leaders. The government that had once dreamed of independence now fought just to stay alive day by day. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, stayed defiant even as his nation fell apart around him. He talked of moving the government south and keeping the fight going as a guerrilla war. But these were the dreams of a man who could not accept defeat. The truth was that the Confederacy was finished as a working nation, its armies broken, its money gone, and its people worn out by 4 years of terrible war. Robert E. Lee, leading the Army of Northern Virginia in the trenches around Petersburg, understood the situation better than his president. His once powerful army had been cut to fewer than 30,000 good men, many of them barefoot, hungry, and armed with old weapons. More soldiers were deserting every day as men slipped away to go back to their families and farms. The siege of Petersburg had gone through the winter of 1864 to 1865, with both armies suffering the pain of trench fighting. The Confederate lines stretched for 37 miles around the city, far too long for Lee's smaller forces to hold well. Grant, meanwhile, kept moving his lines west, forcing Lee to spread his army even thinner. The end started on March 29, 1865, when Grant began his final attack. The Battle of Five Forks on April 1 broke the Confederate right side, cutting the last railroad line into Petersburg. Lee's position was now impossible, and he ordered the leaving of both Petersburg and Richmond. The fall of Richmond sent shock throughout the South. The city that had stood for Confederate resistance for 4 years was now in Union hands, its government buildings taken by black soldiers who had once been enslaved. Abraham Lincoln himself visited the fallen capital on April 4, walking through the streets where Jefferson Davis had once ruled. Lee's army, moving west from Petersburg, was in terrible shape. The men had not been fed properly in weeks, and many were too weak to march well. Union cavalry under Philip Sheridan bothered the moving columns, while Grant's foot soldiers pushed close behind. It was a race against time, with Lee hoping to reach the mountains of western Virginia where he might keep fighting. But Grant's forces were faster and better supplied. On April 6 at the Battle of Sailor's Creek, Union forces captured almost 8,000 Confederate soldiers, including several generals. Lee's army was falling apart, with whole units simply putting down their guns and giving up. The proud Army of Northern Virginia, which had won so many victories against greater numbers, was finally beaten. On the morning of April 9, 186 Tylettery 40, Tylettery 01, Tylettery 35, Tylettery 22, Tylettery 27 Lee found his way blocked by Union cavalry at Appomattox Courthouse. A final charge by Confederate foot soldiers briefly broke through the Union lines, but it was too late. Grant's foot soldiers were arriving in huge numbers, and Lee's escape path was cut off. The Confederate commander faced a terrible choice: give up or see his remaining men killed in a hopeless battle. Lee chose to surrender, sending a white flag to Grant's lines and asking for a meeting to talk about terms. The two generals met in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house. The same man who had run away from Bull Run 4 years earlier to escape the war, only to have it end in his new home. The irony was not missed by people who noticed that the war had started in McLean's backyard and ended in his front parlor. Grant's terms were kind, showing Lincoln's wish for a generous peace. Confederate officers could keep their personal guns and belongings, while regular soldiers could keep their horses for spring planting. No one would be punished for treason, and all would be free to go home if they followed the laws. It was a much more gentle surrender than Lee had any reason to expect. The formal surrender ceremony took place on April 12 with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top, chosen to accept the Confederate surrender. As the Confederate units marched by to stack their guns and give up their battle flags, Chamberlain ordered his men to raise their guns and salute their beaten enemies. It was a sign of respect that helped start the healing process between North and South. But even as Lee was surrendering at Appomattox, a terrible tragedy was happening in Washington. John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Confederate supporter, had been planning to kidnap Lincoln and trade him for Confederate prisoners. When that plan failed, Booth chose murder, believing that killing Lincoln would somehow bring the Confederate cause back to life. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln went to see the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. The president was happy, having just heard news of Lee's surrender. He had talked that day about his plans for rebuilding, stressing bringing the country together and healing instead of punishing the beaten South. Booth went into the presidential box during the third act of the play, when the audience's laughter would cover the sound of his gun. He shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a small single-shot pistol, then jumped to the stage, shouting "Sic semper tyrannies," meaning "thus always to tyrants," the motto of Virginia. Booth broke his leg in the jump but got away on horseback. Lincoln was carried to a boarding house across the street from the theater, where doctors looked at his wound and said it would kill him. The bullet had gone into his brain, and there was nothing doctors in the 1800s could do to save him. Through the long night, government leaders, family, and friends stayed with him as the president slowly died. Abraham Lincoln died at 7:22 on the morning of April 15, 1865, becoming the first American president to be murdered. His death sent shock throughout the country and the world. The man who had saved the Union and freed the slaves had been killed at the moment of his greatest victory. The murder was part of a bigger plan that included attacks on other government leaders. Lewis Powell, one of Booth's helpers, badly wounded Secretary of State William Seward in his home, while George Atzerodt was supposed to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, but got scared. The plan to kill the top Union leaders had mostly failed, but the death of Lincoln was disaster enough. Booth was hunted down and killed by Union soldiers on April 26, 1865, in a tobacco barn in Virginia. His helpers were caught, tried by military court, and 4 were hanged, including Mary Surratt, the first woman ever executed by the federal government. The quick punishment showed the country's anger and wish for revenge. Lincoln's death was mourned across the North and by many in the South, who knew that they had lost their best chance for a gentle rebuilding. The president's body was carried by funeral train from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, with millions of Americans standing along the tracks to pay their respects. It was the biggest funeral in American history up to that time. The murder raised Lincoln to the level of a martyr and made sure his place as one of America's greatest presidents. The man who had been hated by many while he was alive was now seen as the great emancipator who had died for the cause of freedom. His death also made sure that rebuilding would be harsher than he had wanted as radical Republicans took control of the process. Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln's death, was a Tennessee Democrat who had stayed loyal to the Union. But he did not have Lincoln's political skill and moral strength, and his gentle policies toward the South soon put him in a fight with Congress. The rebuilding years would be full of angry political battles that would last for more than 10 years. The war officially ended on May 26, 1865, when the last Confederate forces surrendered in Texas. But the work of bringing the nation back together would take much longer. The South was ruined, its cities burned, its railroads destroyed, and its economy broken. The job of rebuilding would need huge effort and money. The The human cost of the war was huge. More than 620,000 Americans had died, more than in all other American wars together. Hundreds of thousands more had been wounded, many never able to work again. Whole families had been wiped out, and the effect on population would be felt for generations. The money cost was just as huge. The federal government had spent more than $3 billion on the war, leaving a national debt that would take decades to pay off. The South's economy had been completely destroyed with land values falling, and the work system based on slavery ended overnight. But the war had also brought good changes. Slavery had been ended forever, keeping the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. The federal government had been made stronger and modern with new offices and powers that would serve the nation well in the industrial age. The war had also sped up technology and social changes that were already starting brotherhood. The railroad system had been grown and improved. Telegraphs connected far parts of the country, and new factory methods had been created. Women had worked outside the home in huge numbers, and their help in the war effort had begun to change ideas about what they could do and their rights. 4. African Americans, the war had brought freedom, but not equality. The 13th Amendment had ended slavery, but the fight for civil rights would go on for another 100 years. The promises of rebuilding would be broken by the Compromise of 1877, which ended federal protection for black rights in return for Republican control of the presidency. The Civil War had answered the basic questions that had bothered the nation since its beginning. The Union was permanent and could not be broken, and no state could leave it. Slavery could not exist with American ideas and had been ended forever. The federal government was stronger than the states, and the Constitution was the highest law of the land. But the war had also brought new questions about the nature of American democracy and the meaning of citizenship. The growth of federal power during the war had set examples that would be used to support more government control in the economy and society. The fight for racial equality would go on long after the last shots were fired. The memory of the Civil War would shape American politics and culture for generations to come. Veterans groups would become strong political forces, and the Grand Army of the Republic would help elect Republican presidents for decades. The Lost Cause story would make the Confederacy look noble and help support the system of racial separation that took the place of slavery. The battlefields where so many Americans had died would become holy ground, saved as national parks and monuments to the sacrifice of those who had fought and died. Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, and dozens of other places would become places Americans visited to understand their history and honor their ancestors. The Civil War had been the most important event in American history, changing the United States from a loose group of states into a modern nation. The country that came out of the war was stronger, more united, and more dedicated to the ideas of freedom and equality. But it was also hurt by the experience, and the wounds would take generations to heal. As the guns became quiet and the soldiers went home, Americans faced the huge job of rebuilding their nation. The physical damage could be fixed with time and work, but the emotional and mental wounds would prove harder to heal. The war had ended, but its memory would live on for generations to come. The American Civil War had been a tragedy of huge size, but it had also been a triumph of the human spirit. In the darkest hours of the fighting, Americans had shown amazing courage, determination, and sacrifice. They had fought not just for land or political power, but for their deepest beliefs about freedom, equality, and the nature of government. The war had tested the American experiment in democracy and found it strong enough to survive even the worst challenges. The Union had been saved, slavery had been ended, and the nation had come out stronger and more united than ever before. It was a victory that had been bought with blood and money. But it was a victory that would help not just Americans, but people around the world who looked to the United States as a light of freedom and democracy. The story of the American Civil War is finally a story about the power of ideas and the readiness of people to give everything for what they believe in. It is a reminder that freedom is never free, that democracy needs constant watching and work to keep, and that the price of liberty is eternal watchfulness. The men and women who fought and died in that great war left us a gift that we must never forget and a duty that we must never avoid. As we remember the American Civil War today, we honor not just the soldiers who fought and died, but all those who worked to save the Union and spread the blessings of freedom to all Americans. Their sacrifice was not wasted, for they helped build a nation that, despite its mistakes and failures, remains a light of hope and freedom to the world. The war that tore America apart finally made it stronger.